Hey guys, John Beck here with ADV Pulse, and today we're riding the CRF1100L Africa Twin. This year the bike has been completely revamped. It has a new, more powerful 1084cc motor that's actually lighter as well and smaller. The chassis also is narrower and lighter. The suspension settings have been refined. And someone at Honda was listening because now the Africa Twin comes with cruise control. There's also a lot more tech in the bike. It's beyond the previous year by leaps and bounds, so we'll talk about that later. The 2020 Africa Twin, while it looks like the previous models, the experience behind the bars has a feel of more of a redesign than just an update. One of the biggest changes, or most noticeable change, about the Africa Twin in 2020 is probably the new motor. They added 86 additional cc's. It's got 6% more power. The crank remains at 270 degrees, so it still has that V-twin sound and feel to it. The torque allows it to be flicked around, and you can really feel that motor pulling you through stuff in a way that it didn't used to. And at the same time, it's lighter. So it's an amazing change that they managed to get that performance out of the thing and reduce weight. This year, while the displacement of the bike's gone up, the overall package has been reduced both in size and weight. The whole bike's 7 pounds lighter than last year's model. The whole chassis has actually gotten slimmer. It has a bolt-on subframe now instead of a weld-on. The swing arm is designed after a CRF1100L and has lost a pound down there as well. Some things are unchanged on the bike. The suspension travel front and rear remains the same as last year, although the internals have been refined, so it performs better. The seat height is again a 2-position seat height, but the low and high positions are also the same as last year. Earlier we mentioned the electronics package is big. That TFT, there's actually dual displays. This TFT can do a lot. There is 6 ride modes on the Africa Twin. 4 of them are preset, 2 of them are user controllable. To see those ride modes, there's 3 different display options. They're called gold, bronze, and silver, or gold, silver, and bronze in that order. And it doesn't refer to anything related to colors on the screen. What that refers to is the amount of information the bike will show you. So gold is the most information, silver would be the next step down, bronze is the most rudimentary or simplified display. There's a lot of features in here. You just got to take a little bit of time to kind of figure out how to navigate the system. Once you do, what you'll find is the 4 modes that are preset. All 4 of those modes, you do have the ability to change traction control and engine braking. There's 7 levels of traction control, 3 levels of engine braking. And even those, that sounds familiar to anyone that knows the previous Africa Twins, but this year the traction control has actually been expanded in its range of intervention. In other words, previously there was 7 levels, but they were uniform, like level 1, level 2, level 3. The gap of intervention between those was the same. This year they've spread that out. So level 7 now offers more intervention or more control. Level 1 offers less. So, and in between you just pick your range. So it's a lot of options to choose from. Some of the stuff we've been riding is very loose, and it doesn't matter what level traction control is set to, it will struggle when you're in really, really extreme terrain. Turning off traction control, there's nothing here in any of these switch clusters that says traction control off. It's in a menu. So there will be some getting used to that. Before you even get to that, before you even start turning on or off any modes, when you turn the key, the display isn't awake for about 20 seconds. So you can turn the key, fire the bike up, roll away, no problem. But you can't adjust anything. You can't turn traction control or wheelie control off until the display is alive, and then you can get into the modes. So that said, they work great. It's just a matter of, if you're not familiar with this type of a setup, there will be a bit of a learning curve to dive into the system. This year on the road, the Africa Twin's temperament got a lot nicer as well. If you've ridden the previous Africa Twin, it had plenty of power for sure, but it did feel soft, especially when you compare it to most of the bikes in the Leader Plus Adventure class. This thing is very different. It's still, by the numbers, it doesn't feel like it should do what it does. Main thing you notice, especially in the twisties, is as it's going through a corner, it seems like it can hold a higher gear for a lot longer before it needs a downshift. This is the standard 6-speed model. If you ride the DCT model, that's almost like a training tool in a sense, because it doesn't shift where I think I would want it to. It bangs through the gears really quickly. So when I got on this model, I used the shifting pattern, or I sort of borrowed from memory what the DCT was doing. And on this bike, I'll bang through the gears a lot quicker. I mean, after a red light, you can sometimes end up in 4th gear before you're on the other side of the intersection, and the bike's pulling along fine. Doesn't feel like it's lugging. And in the twisties, it actually feels really nice because you don't need to be grabbing gears as much. It's pretty relaxing to ride. And then especially when you fire up the traction control, pick a setting to your liking, on the road it's lean angle sensitive. So you're buried over in a corner grab a handful of throttle and you can go through the corner and kind of let the computer figure out where it wants to rein in the rear wheel. And depending how close you are to level 1, that wheel will definitely step out on pavement. But you can rein that in as you go up to level 3, however much you want. So the motor was definitely Standout. Very smooth too. I spent a lot of very long days on the road, rode all the way, up Owens Valley, did some camping down there, rode all the way down to Baja. So a lot of highway miles, hands aren't buzzy at the end of the day. It's a good road cruiser. Cruise control's really nice. This works really well. Pop this button up or down, 1 mile an hour increments. It'll either speed up or slow down. The speed is displayed on the dash here, and it holds it really well. So once you pick your speed and you're just rolling along the highway, it's got a narrower seat, 2 seat height positions. I tended to prefer the higher position virtually everywhere. I always do off-road. Sometimes on the road, you might want to sit down and relax. On this bike, for me, I'm 5'11", the high position felt better. The windscreen, they do have a taller option for the windscreen. I honestly prefer the lower one. I think it looks better on the bike, but primarily the taller one interferes with the field of vision a little bit for me, and also you get some buffeting, all the typical symptoms. This offers virtually no wind protection. I mean, it's barely above the TFT. It's essentially just to protect the dash, but it has nice, smooth, direct airflow. I never felt like I was getting beat up even on, many hundreds of miles in a day. The bars as well, a little bit high for me. I notice it more off-road than I do on. But even on the road, when you're sitting there, it's not like you're choppered out or anything. It's just, this is a higher bend. So in the twisties, the 2020 model felt a lot more planted, a lot more stable, a lot more flickable all at the same time compared to last year's model. And I think a lot of that you'd probably have to credit to the suspension refinements. Same travel as last year. However, they've changed the amount of oil, they've changed the spring rate, they've changed the damping. And the characteristic of the bike changed drastically, especially in twisties, real tight stuff. Going into corners hard, braking, you don't get the same fork dive like you used to. It doesn't feel like it kind of wants to wander around as much. The redesigned chassis could also be attributed to a lot of that. It's lighter, it's more rigid, it's narrow, so it just has almost like a more dirt bike feel even when you're on the road. When you're in the twisties on the new Africa Twin, that 6-axis IMU comes into play when it's talking to the computer, because the traction control and the ABS are now lean angle sensitive. So buried deep into a corner, once you've found your comfort level among those 7 choices in traction control, crack the throttle and the rear end will back out as much as you want it to. The closer you get to level 1 side of things, level 7 side of the thing, you probably can't break the rear loose if you tried. Totally reins it in, totally controls it. Same applies to braking. You're deep in a corner, it's really confidence inspiring knowing, especially when the ABS is in the road mode, knowing you can grab a handful of brake if you come around a corner and there's a thing in the road that you didn't know was there. It allows you to basically get maximum braking that the computer determines through the IMU. It'll give you the maximum braking that the bike can have given the road conditions. As far as the engine braking and the wheelie control, that got a little bit more nuanced, because this is the only bike I can think of, especially in the adventure class, that has these features, that are adjustable. And so a couple empirical tests, pick a flat stretch of road, pick a gear, pick a speed, and then try the most engine braking and try the least engine braking. And it was tough for me to find a pattern where it was consistent. You definitely feel it, but sometimes it felt like there was a parachute dragging behind the bike, and other times it felt like you're on a coaster bike rolling downhill, just like it was letting go. So there's definitely a difference, and it seems that it's dependent on the terrain, the steepness of a hill. There's all kinds of factors that play into it. But it's one of those things, again, if you like pushing buttons, there's a lot of stuff to play with in here. And speaking of play, a lot of people are probably going to see wheelie control and immediately think hero button, yay, I'm now that guy. Yes and no. There's 3 levels of wheelie control, and between the 3, what it seemed to be is you can dump the clutch, hammer the throttle, and the bike won't loop. So it's essentially a form of launch control. The difference between the 3 levels seemed to correspond to how high the wheel would stay up and how long it would stay up. But regardless of which level was chosen, it seems like every time, before the bike ever got near 45 degrees or so, it would drop the front back down, or at least hold it there. So you'd raise and it would stop. Honestly, it's a little bit unnerving at first, because if you're used to lifting the front wheel with your wrist and having something else override your wrist and do something to the bike that sudden, is a little weird to get used to. But it's definitely a nice safety feature. I mean, you crack that on, and at least the times I tried it, you bang the throttle, you bang the clutch, and it won't loop the bike. While there's a lot in this computer, setting aside the electronics, once you get this bike off-road, the chassis and the motor really start to shine. It definitely has that sort of Honda-esque dirt bike feel that they're known for from their motocross line. And given they've done things like redesign the swing arm and put a detachable subframe, there's a lot of motocross aspects to this bike, and it really shines when it's off-road. It feels very flickable. It's a little bit top-heavy, but it holds the weight well, and it carries it well, and the suspension refinements seem to eliminate a lot of that chatter that you get. I've always liked that about the Africa Twin, is the suppleness of it. For my weight, I'm about 180, 185. It's set up well, and it has always been a little soft in the past, however, a little bit wallowy. This year, with the spring rate changes, with the amount of oil they've changed the damping, even though the travel's the same, it seems to have better bump compliance and better bottoming resistance. So it allows it to go through corners in tight stuff without having that vague feeling that the old one was a little bit subject to. As well, the motor too. Off-road is a huge advantage. Obviously, keeping the front end light on a bike off-road is very important. Keeping the front end light on a bike that is definitely not light is not always easy. So having a good power plant underneath you is really important, and this thing delivers. What I like about it is it doesn't deliver power necessarily in a hard way, and we can get into electronics later. There's obviously ways you can tune that parameter, but overall the torque of the motor again feels like it is more than the numbers would seem to indicate. I found that even off-road it would climb hills smoothly. You'd be able to pick the front end up sometimes, and usually in a gear that was higher than I'd expect, and with RPMs that felt like lower. You know, when I feel like I want to grab a gear, it seems like it would just keep pulling. The ergonomics of the bike are really nice. It's shorter by virtue of the fact it's a parallel twin. Obviously the whole chassis is a little bit shorter than some longer V-twins. It gives it just that more flickable feel because you're making the whole package smaller. Plus the fact that the chassis is narrower, the motor's smaller in diameter, the whole thing got smaller. The only thing that belies that is just this huge dash. Standing, this high bar bend is really nice. For me, it does tread a line of being almost a little bit too high. I'm 5'11". So taller riders, I think, are going to appreciate this because you're definitely not doing any of this. I did try a couple positions where I would rotate the bars back and rotate them forward and just kind of see, you know, as you rotate them too far forward, it gets a little twitchy. Rotating them too far back, they'll actually hit the tank, so you got to watch that. But I found a bar position that I like. Feels very aggressive. It feels like it works generally everywhere. The only caveat I would say is for my height, they do feel almost a little bit too tall, like a little bit, if they were lower, it would feel a little bit more dirt bikey. Other than that though, the geometry between the bars and the pegs is very good. I liked the fact that the chassis is narrower too, because when you're off-road, you're standing, you're obviously controlling the bike with the pegs. You don't have this big thing, you know, between your legs kind of banging you around. It feels a little bit more like a dirt bike because you can flick it through turns with just less motorcycle between the pegs. Off-road riding obviously involves a wide variety of terrain, and we put this bike through a lot of it. Depending on the area you're in, it would, you know, like all adventure bikes, they will excel in some areas and not so much in others. This bike all around was very good off-road. I think a lot of that has to do with sort of the motocross aspects we've been mentioning that have been engineered into it. Those motocross aspects seem to shine some places more than others. So a lot of, like today, what we've been riding is a lot of real rocky stuff, a lot of single track. And in the rocks, the suspension is one of the things that shines because of the bump compliance. It's not soft and wallowy like it used to be. It offers that thing where initially in the first part of the stroke, it's not harsh. You're not getting all that feedback through to the bars or through to the pegs. It feels really smooth. It's really comfortable to ride, and it just beats you up less when the trail seems like it really wants to be beating you up. In the whoops, there's two sides to it. In the whoops, the bottoming compliance on this bike is actually very good. I honestly only bottomed it out a handful of times throughout the entire time I've been testing this thing. What it does do, however, obviously being a big adventure bike, you get this thing into the air, you got to make sure you planned your landing out right because it's still a big adventure bike. Steep hills, steep descents, all of that, it felt really great. On steep hills, that's where the motor will start to shine, because if you're inaccurate with gear selection, say, or you forget to grab a shift or whatever, it does have enough additional torque, that extra 6% of overall power that's claimed. It seems to be able to hold a gear through steep hills without requiring a downshift as often or as soon as you would normally think. Steep descent, same things. The brakes will step in at that point. That front brake not being defeatable, that is an issue that will bite you when you get into the really, really technical stuff. Outside of that, the bike feels great. The biggest thing too when the bike's on big angles, either going up or going down, is the ergos. It's the fact that the bars are very, very high. So for your height, arm length, all that sort of thing, you're going to want to find that happy place. Once I got it to its happy place, it seemed to work pretty well all over. Sand washes are always an interesting thing on adventure bikes because of the weight. This bike, honestly, it likes to be steered from the rear, and that made it feel a lot better. And that may have to do with the narrower chassis and the way they design the rear end and how they're borrowing from those motocross aspects. It really likes being moved around. If it's not being moved around, the front does kind of want to tuck and does kind of want to bury, like all adventure bikes do that have this huge front end thing up there. The suspension as well off-road. The fact that they redid the internals gives it allows the chassis to behave more like a dirt bike. It has less of that stutter bump stuff you get off rocks, and when you go into turns, it doesn't want to fork dive as much as it used to. It doesn't feel quite as soft as the old bike did. Once you get this bike off-road, it gives you several different options to play with, like all the other things in the computer, as far as how the computer is going to manage the bike in the dirt, in the traction. The two preset modes, there's off-road and gravel, and the difference between those is simply, it's somewhat nuanced depending on your feel with the bike, but all it does is it modifies the amount of power that the bike's going to be putting down the rear wheel. And traction control, again, you can modify that in these modes. But once you get into the gravel, essentially in that mode, it's going to help prevent you from making any really disastrous mistakes. And same with off-road mode. It just mellows the bike out a little bit because this motor can deliver power with a sudden hit depending on how you're programming it. So off-road and gravel basically tune the bike down. And that's kind of an interesting point about this bike too, is especially for newer riders or people just wanting to get into adventure biking, there is a safety aspect to it. You can basically say, I'm going to be doing this gravel road, I'm going to be doing this section of terrain. By picking those modes does kind of give you a safety valve because it's going to tune the motor back a little bit. For more advanced riders, almost certainly you're going to want to put it into one of the user modes, and then you can kind of start playing with those settings there. What I ended up doing in the user modes is dialing back all the parameters to the least amount of computer intervention the bike would have. I really like the motor, I really like the chassis, I wanted that to shine through. The computer will tone that back, obviously as a safety feature, but it can tend to veil that characteristic of the bike, and you can feel when it's reacting, particularly traction control. It's in all but gravel roads, it really does kick in when you don't want it to usually. When it gets really loose in sand washes, things like that, a lot of rocks, the wheel fights to find where it wants to be in contact with the ground. However, on dirt roads, on gravel roads, honestly, in any of these modes, you really will never feel the system kick in. It works quite well. So related to how these modes worked off-road, it was really interesting. There's so many and so many choices that they can become nuanced. With 7 levels of traction control, it's like, what's the difference between level 2 and 3? So you have to really play with it to get used to it. So for testing, what I ended up doing is taking the 2 user modes and basically putting them at extreme opposite ends of the scale. So the most power, the most engine braking, the most traction control on one, and then the exact opposite on the other with the least of everything, so the least amount of computer intervention on the bike. In the end, overall, after playing with it and 18 different screen options and a myriad of ways to tune each one of those, I found I boiled down the whole bike to 3 modes. And so there was one for off-road, and then the other 2 modes were for road, either general cruising or twisted pavement. ABS, that's defeatable, but only to the rear wheel. The front stays on, don't know what percentage it stays on to. But there's, in a sense, there's 3 ABS modes. There's on-road and off-road, but off-road has the ability to defeat the front wheel or have the front wheel in off-road ABS mode. And in most situations, actually, I never noticed it. It works really well. I'm used to earlier, clunkier ABS systems when they first started coming out, and they were genuinely terrifying off-road. This bike actually is fine, and you defeat the rear wheel ABS. You can slide it around all you want. However, you will feel sometimes, especially in really steep, really loose descents, that thing where the ABS starts kicking in and you can kind of feel the front wheel chattering a little bit and the lever will pump up on you. The difference I noticed in this bike though is some of them you get that panic where the ABS starts freaking out and the bike just wants to roll away from you. The front wheel keeps slowing. Even in those situations, I noticed the braking is actually still pretty good, but that lever feels really weird. Like the braking will be good, but that lever's fighting you. So just something to get used to. Deciding whether this bike is for you really comes down to the type of rider you are. Are you someone that's been riding motorcycles for a long time and is interested in getting into adventure biking? Someone that's never ridden motorcycles, period, just wants to get into motorcycling and likes the adventure motorcycle concept. This is definitely not what I would consider a beginner bike. It's very powerful, very high performance. It's also very difficult to place because it's also extremely tunable. So you can kind of, in a sense, by programming, make this a beginner's bike or make this an advanced rider bike. It all depends on the settings. You can mellow it out, as much as you want, or unleash it as much as you want. So for the rider looking at this bike, a lot of it's going to come down to, well, obviously aesthetics. It's just if it turns your key, so to speak. And the electronics package is going to be perhaps some sort of a test for some because it is very complex. It's very unique in this market. A lot of bikes are now going to TFT displays, but the depth to which this one can control the motorcycle is beyond a lot of others. So essentially, this bike does apply to a very wide swath of the adventure riding community, because basically if you decide whether or not it's for you, well, you kind of got to go through and program it first to decide if you can make it what you want it to be. Like any adventure bike, there's a few little things you can find that you might want to change, or a few knocks. If I were to swap stuff on this bike, or if there was things that I wanted to modify, things that say the aftermarket companies are going to jump all over, I'd probably start the skid plate. There's more coverage on the skid plate this year than previous, but it is a weight-saving skid plate. It's, obviously they want the numbers of the bike to come in, so it's pretty thin. I can see the aftermarket companies definitely going on that. Bars as well. Again, the bend is good. It's in a good place, but for my taste, they're a little bit swept back. They're not the strongest bars. You can definitely, I've got some witness marks here that testify to that. So I can see some people wanting to swap these out as well. The perches are quite tall also, and they do have a tendency, if you're in really nasty, again, we're talking really nasty rocks, where you're trying to get through a rock field, you can't actually twist the bars because they're on these tall perches that can rotate in their mounts if you hit something hard enough or if you go down. The computer as well. If I were a programmer for this sort of thing, don't exactly know how I do it, to be honest, but it's incredibly non-intuitive when you first get into it, especially trying to choose between gold, silver, bronze. What's gold, silver, bronze? Okay, well, we have to explain that to you. So every little step kind of requires a bit of an explanation. Once you do it, it's fine. But getting over that hurdle of figuring out how you navigate this system will take a little bit of YouTube watching or manual reading or something like that. But again, it goes back to, if you want a lot of features, there's going to be a lot of buttons associated. What sets the Africa Twin apart, if you were just to pick one aspect, what is best about this bike? Honestly, that's going to come down to, what are you as a rider? For me, I prefer off-road. So the standout thing about this bike is the off-road handling. I do like that dirt bike feel off-road. Now, for sure, this bike is not as aggressive as something, say, like a KTM 1090R off-road. That has that race DNA feel. This one is a kinder and gentler form of that. But at the same time, it's pretty fun because of that. It doesn't have a motor that's going to toss you up in a tree if you get out of whack and get sideways. Everything's sort of got rounded edges to it on this bike when you're off-road. It's very forgiving. And you can program it to be as forgiving as you want it to be, really. Overall, that was my takeaway from it, is the fact that I really liked it in the dirt. However, you get on the highway, and something as simple as being able to pop cruise control on, it's a really good highway bike. I was really stoked to be taking this thing on these long trips. I threw on a set of Moscow soft bags on the back and threw a tent in them and did a bunch of camping on the thing. And riding on the highway, it has that great dirt bike feel. And I pull up CarPlay and I'm listening to music and with cruise control on, and all of a sudden it's not a 1250 GS road machine, but it has these aspects that lend characteristics of a great road machine as well. So again, it's a very tough machine to place because it has all these features in it that are really at completely opposite ends of the street versus dirt spectrum. And you can pick and choose which one you want when you want it, really. What stands out, I would kind of say, well, everything. It just depends on which button do you want to push. Even with all these changes, the redesigned motor, the redesigned chassis, the suspension updates, the crazy electronics package they put on the thing now, all of these changes, the price of the bike only went up $800 from last year's model, so it does remain a really good value for this class. The Africa Twin is already available on US showroom floors with a MSRP of $14,399 for the manual transmission version we have here, or $15,199 for the DCT automatic transmission. For more information, check out our full review at advpulse.com, and thanks for watching.